Hello everybody, let me start the 7th CEPR EAERE webinar on climate policy, this time on the economics of border adjustment. This session for the first time is in a hybrid format where we have most of the panelists and paper presentation on board in presence in Paris at the new offices of CEPR. That's something new for us. So welcome everybody. So today we will have a special format for the webinar with a formal presentation by Stefan Ambec, my colleague from Toulouse School of Economics, who will make a short presentation, 30-minute presentation, in fact, of a note entitled Some Economics of Carbon Border Adjustment. And then we will have a roundtable with four prestigious panelists, Agnès Benassy-Quéré, Luis Garicano, Andrei Marcu, and Jean Pisani-Ferry. Before I will give the floor to Stefan, let me tell you a few things that I feel are important to understand before we examine the situation. So first, I believe most of you are aware of the important milestone that happened last week at Ecofin, where our EU Ministers of Finance have decided to support the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM proposal submitted by the EU Commission last summer. So that's an important milestone. I'm sure we will come back to that important decision later on in the roundtable. Let me also remind you that without a resolution of the carbon leakage problem, it will be very hard for Europe to attain its objective. The very ambitious 55% reduction of emissions of CO2 by the year 2030 is extremely ambitious and much more ambitious than most other regions on this planet. And that will probably imply that we will have to penalize much more different industries that are carbon intensive. And so if we are not able to control further carbon leakage, there will be a real social acceptability issue or a political acceptability issue. So we see resistance from sectors benefiting from free allowances to. So you know that CBAM mechanism is a substitute for free allowances, and there is an issue about how to dismantle this second. This relatively inefficient mechanism by this more efficient mechanism of carbon border adjustment. So the timing issue, I believe, will be quite important. And so let me also mention the issue of the geopolitical context these days of this war in Ukraine. What does it mean in terms of trade of fossil fuels reserve around the world? How does it affect the timing and the intensity of the carbon border adjustment mechanism we will have to put in place? Yeah, that will be, I believe, the issue that we will have to talk about today. So without any further details, let me give the floor to Stefan for a 30-minute presentation before giving the floor to the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Here my goal is to give a bit of an introduction to the debate by providing some theoretical background to the question, and also I will describe some challenges that we have to face to. So for the motivation, why are we here to talk about carbon border adjustment? The problem is that climate change is a global problem, but on the other hand, climate policy are implemented locally. So even if there is some coordination in terms of targets, in terms of emissions, in the Paris Agreement, for instance, initiatives to implement carbon policies are being developed locally. The bigger geographic area is the European Union, which implemented the ETS, the emission trading scheme. You have also initiative in California, in Quebec, on the state level, in the US, in Canada, in China, either to implement emission trading systems or carbon taxes. And the problem is that we trade with those areas. So we also have a global trade among the jurisdictions with different carbon policies. And that's a problem because when you price carbon, that increases the cost of production and reduces the competitiveness locally in international markets. And you therefore can have carbon leakage in the sense that some firms may decide to delocalize their production plant in jurisdictions without carbon pricing. Or it could be that locally in the EU, for instance, firms are not competitive compared to foreign competitors, and therefore they face to cheaper. No, I mean, in Europe we have to import non-carbon tax products, and that's a problem because our goal to reduce emissions is not met, either because production is delocalized or because we import carbon-intensive products. So to face this issue, as Christian mentioned, most of the industries that are exposed to international competition or that are energy intensive within EU have allowances for free, so they don't have to buy it. And that creates some kind of subsidy to those firms in the sense that kind of compensate the price of carbon, and that reduces their cost. So the first question is, this project of subsidizing free allowances with CBAM, the carbon budget adjustment mechanism, how this impact trade and emissions? So that's the first question I would like to answer. I will provide a framework to think about this problem in terms of what are the impact on trade and on emissions. And second, with in this project of switching from free allowance to CBAM, CBAM means taxing imports based on the carbon footprint of these imports. There are many challenges that have to be addressed. There are several questions that they are remaining to be solved, to be answered. And the reason is because what you do when you introduce the CBAM is that you tax not based on the emission of production plant, which is what we do in the EU ETS in Europe, but you tax based on the carbon footprint of the product you import. So then there are many questions about how to compare the pricing on emissions from production plant to products. So I will talk about all those challenges in the second part of my presentation. So that's the outline of my talk. First, how free allowance and CBAM impact trade and emissions, and what are the implications for policy design. And second, what are the challenges related to the pricing of foreign products carbon footprint instead of pricing of emissions at the production plant in Europe. Okay, so let's go into economic theory. So assume a partial equilibrium model, consider steel, which is one sector that is included in the CBAM project. Here I have we have the demand for steel and the supply for steel based on production cost. And here I look at the benchmark, which is what's happening if you charge full carbon price. So in the Pigovian spirit, you want to charge the social cost of carbon to domestic firms, and that would happen. That is what would happen with our trade. We have a supply curve in blue reflecting the cost, including the carbon price and demand, and some price and some quantity. But the problem that we face to international competition, we trade with other countries, and in those countries, there is no carbon price, and therefore some steel is entering into Europe at a lower price. So here I have you have the price, supposedly of imported steel. It is an international price, so it is exogenous for the country. And consequently, that some domestic firm are not anymore competitive, and you have a lot of imports. So still you have some firms that may remain competitive, so you can have like on the left some domestic production, but you have also some imports. And those imports are potentially more carbon intensive because they are coming from countries without carbon pricing. Okay, so what can we do? What can you do to reduce import and to reduce carbon efficiency? So another also impact of opening to trade is that you have a reduction of price and you have more production. More production means more pollution. And one target could be also to reduce production. So what you can do is you can provide allowances for free. So instead of paying the full price of carbon, firms get a gift, they get allowance for free. So that's a subsidy that shifts downward their supply curve, their cost is reduced. And you may end up with a situation in which you have not only avoided imports, but you have export. So firms are even more competitive than foreign competitors because they get the subsidy from the regulator. So depending on how much is the subsidy and depending on the cost of controlling emission and production for firms, you may end up with some export. On the right, what's happening if you, instead of having free allowances, you implement the CBAM. The CBAM means that if you want to import steel within EU, you have to pay the carbon tax, the carbon price. So it's not a tax, sorry. You have to pay carbon price equal to the price of the allowances, and that increases the price you can sell the product by the carbon price. So if we compute the carbon price in addition to the international price of steel, that would be the final price. The sum of the two will be the final price for which the steel is imported in Europe. And in this case here, it's higher than the domestic price of steel if Europe is under autarky, and therefore you avoid import. So one consequence is that the CBAM protects against imports and can reach to some autarky, but the CBAM doesn't help to export because what you do, you charge a carbon price on import, but still the European firm will have to pay fully the carbon price, and therefore they have a higher cost compared to their competitor who don't have to pay the carbon price. So that's the first conclusion of this very simple microeconomics 101 analysis. If of allowances, production cheaper, so you increase production by subsidizing output. So the idea that firm can just buy, sell those free allowances into the ETS, and get some cash out of it. and that's increased supply and increased production, and that's what is called in the scale effect of in international trade. You have more production, potentially more pollution. On the other hand, free allowances level the playing field both domestically and on the international market. So by compensating for the extra cost of carbon pricing compared to competitor, the playing field is levelized and domestic firms are competitive domestically and internationally. On the other hand, you have a CBAM. Then the good thing is that you make firms pay for their full externality cost. So it's a Pigouvian policy. And also you level the playing field in the domestic market. So domestic firm, European firm have the same cost that the competitor in the domestic market within Europe, because the competitor will have to pay also the carbon price. One limitation of the CBAM is that it does not help to export. Still, the European firm, if they have to buy the full cost of their carbon emissions, they have a higher price compared to the competitor and they are less competitive on international markets. So then they are not in the same level playing field. So how to levelize the level playing field, as people say in trade? One way to do that could be to charge the full carbon price only to local supply, but not to export. So one possibility could be to refund part of the carbon price that is paid on the output that is exported by European firms. So the idea of export rebates. So in this case, for those export units, then the European firm and American and Brazilian and Chinese firm will have will be on the same playing field, same cost. Another solution is to subsidize directly pollution abatement. So this is something that has not been discussed so far, but take the example of steel. That there are massive investment for shifting steel production to power and hydrogen-based steel production. There are projects in France, in Dunkirk, and also in Sweden, in Luleå. And this requires a massive investment, and part of the European funds are target to those investments, and if with this kind of investment, you can also try to level the playing field. So another solution: subsidize pollution abatement, use investment into decarbonization of production. Now, what about emission? So let's go back to this framework, and let's try to think about what are the impact of the two policies, free allowances and CBAM, on emissions, not only on trade, but also about on how much we emit, because this is what matters for climate change. So here, what I have plotted on the bottom is the emission factor, under the assumption that the emission factor is lower for domestic firms, European firms, because they are incentivized to reduce their emission factor by the carbon price, than the emission factor abroad. So abroad, it's 1-to-1 in this graph, and domestically in green is lower. So you can plot from the production how much we emit on this graph just by going through this emission factor. So for instance, if we are on Turkey, the production is here, and then you follow the green line to get the emission here. Now, if you open to trade, then you have a lower price, some import. Those import have this level of emission factor. And sorry, so domestic production with this level of factor. So this is domestic production, this level of emission, and the import have a higher emission factor, and therefore you end up with this level of emission. Now with allowances, what's happening is that by substituting import with local production and exporting, you have what is called a composition effect. You substitute higher carbon intensive products with lower carbon intensive products. So then you have to take this emission factor in green, and therefore even if you have more production with allowances, you end up here in these examples with less emission. Why? Because European steel is less carbon intensive than foreign steel. So here, the good thing with exporting is that you substitute even not only in Europe, but also on the international market, carbon intensive steel with less carbon intensive steel, and therefore you manage also to reduce emission, not only within the EU border, but also internationally, outside the borders, which is good for the climate and for Europe as well. With the CBAM, you have also this effect that if you enter to trade, you have an increase of emission from autarky to opening to trade, and with the CBAM you go back to autarky, and therefore you manage to reduce again your emission. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. It's not only about trade; it's also about emission. And helping to export is one way to reduce greenhouse gas emission internationally. And again, because carbon emission is a global problem. Yeah. So let me finish with a little bit a roadmap for the discussion that is following my presentation. So I've talked about the general principle of switching from free allowances to CBAM. Now we have to talk about the details. How to design this CBAM. So the way the ETS is working is that firms, production plants are reporting their emission, and they have to pay based on their reporting emissions. They have to buy allowances on the market based on their reported emissions. Now, what we have to do with the CBAM is to charge products that are imported based on their carbon footprint. So, first question, how to measure the carbon footprint of a product, not a production plant, and the product that is manufactured abroad, so for which we don't have data. So one solution that has been proposed in the current project is to do some benchmarking to base the carbon footprint of the equivalent of the carbon footprint within the European Union. So 1 ton of steel produced within the EU. If you do that, you avoid what is called resource shuffling. That is the fact that if you, so the other solution is to do some kind of carbon certification to try to measure the emission of foreign production plants. The good thing with this certification and measurement of carbon emission abroad is that the still provide incentives to reduce carbon emission, to invest in controlling emission, in pollution abatement. Abroad, not only within the EU. The bad thing is that you may have this resource shuffling problem, which is happening in the US for California, which has the same problem of, so California also has implemented a carbon budget adjustment mechanism for power that is imported from Arizona or Nevada or Oregon. And the problem is that, Nevada, they pretend that all their power that is green, coming from renewable, is exported to California. And the dirty power is just consumed locally. So that's the resource sharing problem, the fact that you may end up not providing the right incentives to reduce emissions if you have this kind of manipulation of carbon certification. We need also to attribute the carbon footprint of products that is produced by multiple production plants, so that the problem that the emission, you don't have a mapping from production plant to product. There is also the idea to adjust the carbon footprint of the imported product adjust to the fact that the country of origin has implemented the carbon pricing, the carbon price, or a climate policy, with the idea of creating this climate club that has been put forward by William Nordhaus, like trying to provide incentives to other countries to implement also a carbon price system. But that's another level of complexity. You need to compare the carbon price in China, in Europe. In China, they have implemented the carbon pricing system based on emission intensity, not on absolute emission. So that's difficult to compare. So that's another level of complexity that we have to decide. In the current project, the idea is to base the measure of the carbon footprint on direct emission from the production plant, but not the emission upstream the production plant. So for instance, if the production plant is switching from thermal, using its own energy, producing its own energy with thermal power, to outsourcing its energy to a power company, then we observe a drastic reduction of the carbon footprint, even if this power company is still producing energy with coal. So that's one problem of measuring only direct emissions. But again, simplicity against maybe a more realistic measure of emissions. And the last point I will mention is that so far, the CBAM project targets industries that are upstream, so a subset of industries that are in the EU ETS. And then the problem is what's happening along the supply chain. So think about steel again. So steel is used to produce cars or planes. If you have a CBAM on steel, then that increases the price of steel in Europe, but not outside Europe. And there's a risk of delocalization, not on the steel industry, but more on the car and plane manufacturing industry, because by moving their production plant abroad, they will be able to have access to cheaper steel. So what do we do for the downstream industry? So that's also an open question. So far, it's not on the project, but this is something we have to think about.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So you are perfectly on time. There are already 3 questions from the Q&A. Let me just mention 2. The third one is associated to whether CBAM is WTO compliant, but I believe that some of the panelists will be happy to answer that specific question. Now, there is one question on what's the impact of CBAM on EU exporting competitivity. And so here, I mean, let me just mention that if we take the steel industry, that on which Stefan focused on, I made a very quick computation last week. 1 ton of steel produce almost 2 tons of CO2 to be produced by the standard technology using coal. So meaning that if you take an average price of the ton of steel over the last decade, that has been around 500 euros, and if you assume a price of carbon at around 100 euros per ton of CO2, that means that adding carbon pricing to the steel production in Europe would increase the carbon cost, the cost of producing steel, adding the carbon cost around, it would increase by more than 33%, more than a third. So clearly, if we are alone to do that, I mean, the steel industry will be completely destroyed, and its ability to export steel will completely disappear. And then there is one question for you, Stefan, but I think you already answered in your presentation. This would subsidizing exports covered by domestic carbon price be part of CBAM? I think you said that the right CBAM is to impose a carbon border adjustment to imports and to offer rebate for exports. So let me know. Go to the panel.
Sure. On the steel industry. So there are 2 solutions. It could be that you pay directly the carbon price, or you invest into abatement. This is what they are doing. The steel is very expensive. So steel is produced with coal, coke, and is very energy intensive. The solution is to produce steel with hydrogen and hydropower. This is what some companies are investing or trying to introduce, to try to move to this new technology. And they have estimated that will increase the cost of steel by 30%. So it's the same kind of magnitude, plus 30% of cost.
So meaning that at the price of 100 euros per ton of CO2, the industry, the steel sector may switch to decarbonized technology.
Yeah, but that would be good for climate. So don't forget the carbon pricing is good for climate.
Exactly. Sure, that's the objective. So let me start the panel now, and keep in mind that, dear member, you are almost 300 participants right now. So there will be 10 minutes for each of the panelists to provide his own view on the issue before we move to a debate among the panelists and then with the participants. So don't hesitate to feed in the Q&A of this Zoom meeting. So let me first introduce Agnès Benassy-Quéré, who will be the first panelist to talk. Agnès Benassy-Quéré is chief economist at the French Treasury. She's also, of course, economics professor at Paris 1 and at the Paris School of Economics. Agnès, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. So I would like first to motivate CBAM with a few figures, and then move to the agreement of March, the Council agreement, and finish with the international aspects of CBAM, especially the idea you mentioned of the climate problem and how it fits into this kind of idea. Okay. So first, why CBAM? I wanted to show a recent study by the IMF, which is on the right-hand side of the panel, where the IMF has recalculated carbon leakages on a relatively recent period. It used to be the case that carbon leakages were considered as negligible. However, in recent years, this fact has been reconsidered, and here you see the average for the EU is about 15%, meaning that when you avoid 100 tons in the EU, then 15 are created elsewhere. but it can be very high for some countries. Belgium or Austria, France, these are Switzerland. These are countries with very, very high carbon linkages. So on top of that, we have very different commitments in terms of carbon reductions. As you know, the UK and the EU are on the top of the left-hand side panel, where the commitments of carbon reductions are much more ambitious, even within advanced economies, much more ambitious in Europe. Sorry.
Yeah, because there's a arrow in the corner on the left, you want to go back.
Okay. Thank you. So on the right-hand side, you see the recent evolution of the carbon price, ETS price, and actually the increase has been impressive. The figures of leakages I just showed before were before this increase in the ETS price. So the higher the price, the more room for carbon leakage. On the left-hand side, you see the situation of the EU compared to, so EU is here, compared to other countries. So on the x-axis, you have the share of domestic emissions that are subject to carbon pricing. So EU is about 50%. And on the y-axis, you have the carbon price level in 2020. And EU is above $30 per ton. As you see in the right-hand side, it's much higher now. So above that, you have Switzerland, Norway, which are relatively small emitters of carbon. And so the gray circle represents the size of the emissions. So you really see that on both criteria, the EU is very ambitious. So I try to do it correctly. Sets. As Stefan just presented, relying on free allowances can be a solution to avoid carbon leakages, but it's going to be increasingly inadequate going forward. First, because there is going to be a decreasing number of allowances, more stringent benchmarks. So either you increase free allowances, which would then come back to the initial point, or it will be more and more difficult for firms to get free allowances. There is a behavior of hoarding that blurs the price signal also due to free allowances, and on the whole, there is a weakening of the incentive to decarbonize. This is meta-analysis of literature ex-ante modeling of CBAM. The gray circle represents an estimate of carbon leakages, so the rates between, let's say, 2% and 18% or 20%. And the blue diamonds represent the amount of reduction of the leakages. So of course it's different across the different studies, but you really see that it can be substantial. Now, what is the March 22 agreement about? So it was an agreement at the Council. So the idea is to create an instrument that will closely mirror the EU ETS. So compared to your graph, actually the price with the CBAM will never be above the domestic price. It cannot be because it's a narrow, it can be if the foreign country is more expensive before CBAM, but not if it has the same price. It's a specific non-tradable allowance, so it's not going to be traded with domestic ETS. There is going to be a 3-year transitional period from 23 to 25, where only reporting and monitoring will be required. So in order to test the information network, no financial adjustment on imported products until 2026. As you said, 5 pilot sectors, which were selected because of the higher risk of carbon leakage. But that represents almost 50% of emissions covered by the ETS, so it's very substantial. And they were also selected because these are homogeneous products. So the problem you mentioned of estimating the carbon emissions is less acute for this kind of product. All the more that there will be a default value which can be used if there is no possibility to declare actual emissions. And on top of that, explicit carbon pricing schemes will be taken into account to reduce, of course, the CBAM charge, and it will be focused only on direct emissions. So to give you an idea of the timeline, as a first step, so here you have this line, this horizontal line represents the third country emissions in, say, steel. So for few foreign producers, steel, and you just calculate the total emissions of its exports to the EU. In a second phase, in the second step, 26 to 2035, a CBAM charge will be imposed, but the emissions, the equivalent of emissions covered by the free allocation. So suppose that in the EU, 20% of emissions are covered by free allocation. So there will be also a 20% rebate on CBAM for imported goods in order to guarantee equivalence, equal treatments between domestic and foreign suppliers. And the final phase, which is 2036 onward, you may discuss whether this is too late, but this is the Commission proposal. Then there will be a CBAM charge of the total because allowances will be phased out. Now I will skip the details. Still pending 3 points. First, so the speed of the phasing out of the free allowances. Second is the question of the returns of the CBAM, and more generally all the discussions about own resources, which is not set yet. And third, the cooperation with third countries. And I wanted now to focus on the cooperation with third countries. So as you said, CBAM allows to establish a level playing field and especially to avoid leakages for the domestic market. So foreign suppliers will be treated exactly the same way as domestic one on the EU market with this narrow ETS charge. And it will be, so the idea is to encourage third countries to adopt more ambitious climate policies. But as you said, foreign suppliers who not necessarily pay a carbon price already in their country will not pay a carbon price as high as the EU on their own market and on third markets. So there is a risk of carbon leakages on the export side. So the question is whether EU firms should be compensated. This is the idea of free allowances, but if we want to phase them out, then what's next? So there's also this idea of being exempted, which you presented, which is the idea of a rebate. The question is whether it is WTO compatible. So here there's a big question mark. The phasing out of free allowances will go through the revision of the ETS directive. So it's not in the CBAM agreement, it's a different package, which is the revision of the ETS directive. What is important is not only the speed, but also the predictability of the phasing out in order for sectors to adjust. So now I will finish with the idea of a club and how this can be fitted in. So we all know this idea of Modals of a climate club, which is not exactly the same because the idea is to have a tariff, not ETS, lower ETS price at the border. But there is the same idea to incentivize third countries to join the club. However, what is very important in the Modals Club is that it is organized around an explicit carbon price, not an implicit one, which makes things much more easier. And and we all know that carbon pricing is much more flexible. It has nice properties. It responds to technological change in a flexible way. It will avoid the rebound effect. So we all know this. And so the big question is, what if other countries introduce regulations that can be very, very stringent, and how can CBAM coexist with this? First, I wanted to say that CBAM is the first mover. So, of course, over the 10 years, there will be some change, some adjustments. Some other countries will also move, but someone needs to move first. And the idea is that countries that have high ambition should not be prevented from moving first. So, waiting until we have a solution to the equivalence between carbon price, explicit and implicit carbon price is probably not the right way to do it. So if I have only 5 minutes.
No, not 5 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. So no, I wanted. Well, sorry. I wanted to go back. So just to say that the OECD has launched an initiative to calculate some equivalence between explicit and implicit pricing, and it's extremely complicated. There are all sorts of unknown, and we also need to think that regulations are sector specific, whereas prices are across the board. But I wanted to finish with something that is less understood, I think, in the debate, is the issue of residual emissions in international trade. So here I've put a very simple monopolistic competition model where you have a firm I that export Xi, which depends negatively on its price by Pi. The elasticity of demand is sigma. And so you can write the profit, and you have marginal cost, which is C. And you have residual emissions. So after making the investments you are suggesting, still there are some emissions which are a function of the exports with epsilon positive. And tau will be the carbon price. And suppose that you have two countries, say the EU and the United States. And the EU relies on carbon pricing, whereas the US relies on regulations. Suppose that they are equivalent. So in both cases, the marginal cost increases. So you have the same marginal cost C. If you have no carbon pricing, tau is equal to 0. The optimal price is very standard markup on the marginal cost. But if you have a positive carbon price, then you can write the price as the previous price plus something that is, of course, depends on tau, also on the elasticity on the marginal cost, and also on the epsilon. If epsilon is 0, of course, this disappears because there is no it's the fixed term here. So what I wanted to say is that you can have even if you have an equivalence between implicit and explicit price between two countries, still, and it's related to the rebound effect, in fact, still you have an incentive to make more effort in the EU, and you have a price that is higher than the foreign country because of this additional taxation of residual emissions. So the climate club needs to address these residual emissions. So it's not the end of the story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnès. Let me directly switch to the next panelist, Luis Garicano. So Luis already contributed to previous webinar on the same topic last year. Thank you very much, Luis, for accepting to contribute again, because it's still a very important issue in the agenda of the EU Commission and EU Parliament. So, Luis, you are a member of the EU Parliament and you are also an economics professor at IE Business School. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here. I will cover some of the basics, but I think Agnès and Stefan did a great job. And I will just go look at how ambitious title economics, political economy, and legislation. I will push fast through the basics in order to get to the end, and which is what is new indeed right now. So on the basics, I think we heard really good contributions here. Carbon pricing schemes only in a few places. In spite of the big effort, we have seen huge increases in greenhouse gas emissions, 40%. The EU has not only set, but also achieved pretty ambitious targets in terms of both the initial set of targets for 2020 and the ones now for 2050, very, very ambitious. The first one, as I said, we met these targets to today. Just 4 or 5 facts about the ETS, the pricing scheme in Europe. We know that it's the first carbon pricing scheme. It operates in all EU countries, plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, limits emissions in 11,000 heavy energy using installations, so not other type of situations, and it covers 40% of EU greenhouse emissions. But the problem, of course, and Agnès had beautiful graphs on this, is that, of course, we have this problem where leakage has been increasing. We have decreased by 21%, while we have actually our domestic producers have produced of carbon, but our imports embed increasing amount of carbon, an increase of 28% of carbon in our imports. So we need a CBAM, and I think everybody's clear on this. First of all, it's basically necessary in order to avoid this leakage, substituting 101 current production, which damages the planet the same and hurts jobs and industry in Europe. So where are we in terms of current consensus? Agnès gave a very good overview of the Council proposal. I want to comment on where the legislation is and talk a little bit about the political economy. So we had a report last year, the Commission had a proposal. Now the Council had an initial agreement on the 15th, which Agnès discussed, and then Parliament now has to set its position before we go to trilogue. So we are doing right now that. We are negotiating as we speak. I'm negotiating for Econ like I did last year. Well, last year was the main question in Econ, now I'm a shadow rapporteur. There are some consensus that are very clear in Europe that were not clear a year and a half ago, so we have to be happy. First, it's clear that this is environmentally, the objective is environmental, and that WTO compatibility is necessary, and that because the objective is environmental, we want to take into account anybody else who is already making reductions. We want to take it into account. And yes, talked about the US and regulation instead of price. We'll talk a little bit about that later if I have time. And we should allow them to make abatements, to have prices, and to use that to demonstrate their true carbon content and get better pricing. The second consensus is on ETS. There was last year doubt on whether we would use excise duties, customs, or ETS. Now that it's clear that it's going to be ETS. But we have somebody's knocking in the door, and I'm so sorry because this is working from home. Let me see if I can solve this. Sorry, 5 minutes. I can't go now. 5 minutes. A neighbor who needs an Amazon package. I'm so sorry. So types of emissions. So where are the problems still remaining? There are on scope, what is included, direct or indirect emissions. On horizontal coverage, only 5 sectors versus all the sectors, and on vertical coverage, downstream versus raw. Stefan covered all this in the theory. Right now, the compromise only offers direct, nothing about indirect, horizontal, only 5 sectors, and vertical, only raw materials. On scope, on indirect emissions, I think they need to be included. I agree, it's hard. There is discussions right now. For example, coal, other ways to generate electricity, but also if you use carbon capture or storage and you use electricity, but the electricity comes from dirty sources, you might be reducing carbon, but then increasing it through the dirty source. Horizontal coverage, I think it was mentioned by Stefan, you have steel, you substitute by glass, then or cement by glass, then you're getting your product mix wrong and you're also polluting. Vertical coverage, distortions between raw materials and intermediate and final products. Substituting, you import some basic material or you import a finished material and then you embed the aluminum. So vertical coverage is necessary to be expanded. What is the compromise that is looking likely? I think on indirect emissions, I think that we are looking towards including some in the Parliament proposal. On horizontal and vertical, I think what we will do is include a binding calendar that makes sure, and that gives the certainty that Agnès was talking about, that makes sure that we have visibility on where horizontal and vertical coverage is going to be expanded. But I think it's essential to avoid substitution and distortions. Free allowances, very complicated issue. Second of the big issues, scope, free allowances, export rebates. The question here is not economics, it's political economy. It's clear that right now the industry has basically most production is actually as a free allowance. Why? Because these curves, this kind of quasi-supply curves of CO2 produced by installation, basically everybody is, a huge share of the production is below the 10% best, which you would expect in the commodity industry. And that means that basically everybody is polluting for free. All these are free allowances in the green. So we obviously want to phase out the free allowances. The Commission and the Council say, well, in the ETS derivatives, there has to be a phase out, and the directive sets a transition phase. But as I will tell you in a second, it's very complicated because, okay, the Greens on the one hand want to phase this out for sure as soon as possible so that all the pollution has a price that's sensible. But if we don't have the CBAM, then as Christian said and Stefan, then we're going to have a lot of trouble for the European industry. On the other hand, the industry position is, oops, viva, we have the free allowances. Let's also keep the free allowances and the CBAM. That position is couched in nice language, such as, well, we have to see if CBAM really works before we remove the free allowances. Let's see how, when we remove this, etc. Very dangerous type of approach because we might end up with the worst of all worlds. A possible compromise is remove the free allocation, do a phase out that has the phase in at the same time. Third, the biggest elephant in the room that is nowhere in the proposals, maybe Agnès wants to discuss that a bit more, but it's the export rebate. It's very clear, and Stefan gave a very, very clear explanation of how this cannot be done. I mean, you're going to get, through CBAM, you're going to get competitiveness in the internal market, but you're going to get destroyed externally because you actually pay full price for carbon and compete for people who don't pay. So you should try to put some free allowance, but neither the Commission or the Council, export rebate, but neither the Commission or the Council are considering because they are scared from the perspective of international trade. They think that if we have export rebates, WTO type logic is going to kill us. I don't agree. I think what we have is in the domestic markets, we're level playing field, and the export markets, nothing changes. We have the same situation as today, which is that there is some benchmark that we're giving back to the top, equivalent to the top performers. So what you would do is in the domestic market, you are removing, you're removing the free allowances, you get CBAM, and you are replacing them in external market with an export rebate, which would be identical to the current free allowances. I think that's a reasonable thing. We should be able to do it. One last point that we have in this agreement is the governance. The current proposal, the Council and the Commission want 27 authorities. I think this is a massive mistake for a very simple reason. It's a common border of the EU, but everybody is going to want to go where the border is lower, where it's easier to go. You're going to introduce competitive distortions between Malta and Spain and France on who is giving these free allowances. If it's a same border, there should be the same system And that's why I think it needs to be the same authority. I had removed these two things on WTO compatibility, but one of the persons asking us, is this WTO compatible? Our view is that it is, because there's no discrimination between imported and domestic goods in the foreign market and the external market. And there is a most favored nation clause that means every country actually pays the same. One last thing on trade. The point that Agnès was discussing, the Americans are, everybody's very worried about this, but the Americans are particularly worried. In fact, they're furious. The reason they're furious is they say, you're going to hit us with this CBAM, but we are making biggest efforts. We just closed with the Obama administration of the sulfur plants, and we are totally clean, etc. The way we are going to manage to get this CLAB and this carbon pricing, and at the same time, take into account people like the Americans who are not using carbon pricing, even though they invented it, and want equivalence through regulations, is a nightmare. I don't know how we're going to do it. While we have these first five, it's easy because the exports of steel don't come from America. When we want to expand, we are going to be in massive trouble. I've talked to people in the Treasury, and the language doesn't fit. The clash seems really worrying and complicated. Thanks very much. I hope I didn't go over.
Thank you very much, Luis. That was very clear and indeed very useful to better understand what's going on in Brussels and in Strasbourg. So next panelist is Andrei Marcu. He's founder and executive director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition.
First of all, thank you very much, Christian, for inviting me. I'm intimidated by such firepower of economists. I am not an economist, I have to tell you that. I'm an engineer that has kind of, over the years, I think I've internalized what sounds like reasonable economics, but we'll find out how reasonable it is. And I've internalized a lot of the if you want the economic, political economy, what's going on in Brussels. The work that we've done, and to give you an understanding, comes from a trio, because we work with Aaron and Michael, and Michael is academic, and Aaron is a guy that's much greener than I am, and I come from an intersection of business and policy. So it's a balance somewhere, and we end up with what we end up. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is that, first of all, what you don't know, Christian, when you invited me, is that I am running a think tank in Brussels that I've created, but I'm also on a pro bono basis when I go to COP or negotiate on behalf of G77. So you're going to hear something that's a little bit G77-ish. Maybe you want it or not, I don't know, but this is what it is. The second thing is I have impeccable background when it comes to carbon pricing, because I was there since 1996, and I'm impeccable. I work with Richard Sandler and Maurice Strong and all these people who introduced carbon pricing from the very beginning. So I'm above suspicion. Like,
I know you.
Like Caesar's wife, like Caesar's wife. So now let's go. What is this CBAM? Why is this an inevitable solution? What is it? Because if you know what happened in Brussels, you know that until about 3 years ago, if you brought 4 years ago, until Madame von der Leyen came, if you mentioned the word carbon border adjustment, it was a dirty word. I mean, you literally, we run out of town by senior people in European institutions. It's not something we make up, it's the reality. They didn't like that. And I think, I am not so sure that the European institutions are in love with carbon border adjustment. Now, is it, I'm not sure why it's coming out like this, but in my mind, the CBAM is like a Swiss Army knife. It's good for many, many things. And it's made attractive. Why? Because we have carbon pricing, and you need to do something that looks also an accompaniment to carbon pricing. You also have the fact that, and I think this has been said before, so I'm going to repeat a lot of things, we are way ahead in terms of ambition. There's no doubt about that. Yes, I know the Americans and the Chinese and 2050, I know that. But by the time we get to 2050, our motto is very clear. We are here to decarbonize, not to deindustrialize Europe. And I know the one thing that I know is that to gain a customer is very difficult. To lose a customer is very easy. To gain a customer is very complicated. So once you lose them, I'm not sure you get it. So it is something that we need to be careful about. Now, why is it inevitable? Because the reality of a decreasing cap and the fact that there will not be simply mathematically will not be enough free allocation to give people. That's mathematics. It's not something that by the end of 20s, maybe early 30s, but end of 20s will be out of free allocation. And the fact that hasn't been mentioned, because a lot of things have been mentioned, is the fact that you have this linear reduction factor, is the curve that goes down. It goes down now with a certain slope. But don't forget that in 2023, you're going to go to a COP when there's the global stock take, and there's going to be another set of pressure on Europe to do more. And in 2028, there's another stock take. So it's going to be another set of pressure on Europe to be the leader and show more. So this is not over. This is going to be increasingly acute as the time goes by. Are we going to be matched by everybody else? I don't know. Yes, in 2050 we will be, but until 2050 we still have to live into 2030. And then there is, sorry to say this, there's an end of reallocation ideology. There are people who ideologically from the very beginning did not like free allocation. They think that it mutes the carbon price. It think that it subsidizes industry, it does all kinds of dirty things. And simply they find this a very good moment to end up free allocation. Right or wrong, I don't know. But this is the whole group of people that come together. And as a result of that, the end of free allocation is probably there. It's difficult to fight it at this point. I think a lot of people have concluded that's not an easy thing to do. Now, what I am of two minds, because I think that you do need to show the true price of carbon. You do need to show the price of carbon because the people have to know what it costs. I mean, that sounds idealistic and romantic, but it's true. But at the same time, it also makes the EU more complex. We started, listen, I started in the SO2 market. That's where I started. The SO2 market is simple and stupid. You put a cap, you go away and you come back. There's no free allocation, everything is fine. So it was a very, very simple process. It had a great attraction for all of us. And the last thing is that there's lack of incentive. Now, if you go to the Council conclusions, and I will take issue with this, is what's it, application to prevent emissions and will do their allocation to non-EU countries increasing port. What we need to make up our mind, because when we started this, the first discussion that we had was that the reason why we're putting this is we want to charge the people who export to the EU and the people who import in the EU the same amount for the total carbon embedded as the European pay. That was the carbon leakage argument. These guys are paying, these guys are not paying, this doesn't work. Well, now all of a sudden we're getting into a very different business. And the very different business is a business where we're telling other people what to do. I'm sorry to say this to you, but this is the reality. We are basically telling people, yes, you have the Paris Agreement. Yes, you have the Paris Agreement. And yes, we will contribute, each of us will contribute what we can. But if you don't contribute what we do, then we will tax you at the border. Now, that is reality. And this is how many in the G77 see it. And it's not, we're not talking about small countries, we're talking about India, we're talking about China, we're talking about very large countries. So we got to be very careful that also the way this is handled. I'm more indifferent to the WTO. I'm more interested in climate diplomacy and how this is going to play in the climate diplomacy realm. Now, what are the crunch issues? The time horizon, with and without the ETS. In my own humble opinion, and again, I like carbon pricing, the ETS hasn't sunset. By the early 2030s, the ETS is going to run out of the liquidity. And I don't think that you want a price discovery mechanism if you don't have liquidity in the market. I think this is what I know about markets. The second thing is the issue of free allocation. Why? Because the curve goes down very low, and you started about 2 billion allowances, and you're now about 800, 900 million. And if you keep going down, 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 there's basically you're going to have an auction, and that's going to be that. There's not going to be any trading. There's going to be just price discovery. People going at the auction and buying it, and that's about it. That's not much of a liquid market.
Good. We will come back.
Yeah, I'm happy to know that. Free allocation versus CBAM is this issue that we have mentioned. The balance between going up and down between the free allocation and the CBAM. Then the issue of exports, again, it's also been mentioned. The indirect cost versus circumvention, again, is circumvention is a real issue, but is this an issue that really depends how you define CBAM? And non-price policies, yes, I fully understand how complicated it is. I know about the OECD program, we fully understand that. And I think that Luis has made a very good point. The point is that what we have right now, we're dealing with Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and Morocco, and I don't know who else. The moment you start introducing chemicals, all of a sudden you start dealing with the US and China. So this gets a lot more complicated. That's why chemicals were proposed by the Parliament, but then kind of disappeared in the Council conclusion. But you still have to negotiate in the trial. It's not over until it's over. So I think that not considering non-price policies when you're dealing with the Americans that do not have, and yes, we are in a situation where we have a sympathetic administration in Washington, but you are going into November election. And I am not so sure what's going to come out of that. So it's something that we really have to keep in mind. My understanding is that it is very complicated, but politically it's not off the table. That's my understanding. Again, I'm not a member of Parliament. I think the gentleman before me knows a lot more than me, but my understanding is that's not off the table. Final last thing is the use of revenue. Yes, it's no how to spend it. In the Financial Times, there's a section called how to spend it. How do you use it? Do you use it for your own revenue, or do you use it for putting it in for local industry, giving it back to us, to the people who have paid it at the border, in order to do mitigation? It really depends. Giving it to LDCs, well, yes, sounds great. LDCs and SIDS sounds great, but the fact of the matter is the only LDCs that export anything of any significance to the EU is Mozambique, that has aluminum plants at Cabora Bassa. That's about the only people. So I think that the use of revenue is going to be an issue, but I'm not sure whether this is going to be the deadliest issue, even though money usually it's important. Now, the thing that I mentioned refers to the conclusions, have some caveats in there, the revenues, free allocation, free allocation and carbon clubs. Now, there is a provision in the Council conclusion that talks about the request of the second member state, that we can guess who the next member state is, to deal with the adverse introduction and on export. So export is a big deal. Christian, you mentioned steel. I haven't done, we've done for other industries in Brussels, we've done studies on confidentiality basis, so we can't really get into them. Unfortunately, they won't allow us to give the numbers, which you don't understand why, because the numbers will really make their case, but that's their choice. The only study that I can tell you is that 7 years ago, we did a study on aluminum at a 15 euros a ton. It was about 10 to 12% of the bottom line. And these people trade on the London Metal Exchange, so there is, you can't pass the cost through. But this is not unimportant. The other thing that I would say, if at 100 euros a ton, it doesn't make a difference in competitiveness, then these people must be sitting on an enormous margins. Otherwise, it makes no sense. It's impossible. It's just counterintuitive. Now, the discussion has been talked about the 3 channels for carbon leakage, and export is one of them. There's no doubt about that. Production, investment, the other one, and the current proposal simply does not address the proposal from the Commission. It's been punted over down. I think that this is not a sustainable conversation at this point. Do export matter from our point of view? I will not go into this because we don't have the time, but we have a paper that I will refer you at the end. And yes, exports make up a significant percentage of EU production in some industries, and in some industries, a very large part of production. There are companies that export 50% of their production. Yes, on average, I repeat, EU production is better in terms of carbon intensity. It's not necessarily true for every sector and every product, but on average, I assume it's better. And yes, and this is a language that I don't like, but has been used quite a lot. There is a high likelihood of carbon leakage. I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I can tell you that there's a high likelihood if you make a logical assumption the way and take 1 and 2, 3 will follow. And the third one is that the politics on not including exports, in our opinion, again, I'm not a policymaker, I'm a think tank, but I've been around this for a long time, and I think I understand a little bit, may impact the overall political negotiation and discussion. I think that is our view on this. Now, what we are proposing is the fact that you have a number of things to take into account. One of them is, and talking about exports now, one of them is the fact that you may get into entanglement with the WTO. Possible. It is possible. And the consequences of that is what it is. Or you may get into the risk of a carbon leakage with the consequences for the European industry. I'm not an economist, but I normally do multiply the probability by the consequences compared to 2. And I think that the second one is a very difficult political decision. Now, what I think I'm running out of time, Christian, so what I wanted to say is the following thing. In terms of the WTO, the answer is nobody knows. And you will not know until you get in front of the appellate body. You simply will not know. The CBAM itself is vulnerable to an appeal to WTO. Is appeal to national measures. Yes, it is vulnerable to that, and we will not know that. It is a matter of, like my colleague says, Aaron Cosby would say, it's a time to be brave. Why? Because we think that a lot of the WTO case law has been put forward at the time where instruments like emissions trading were not around. A lot of things have been changed and are fallen as a result of climate change, and the whole world is changed. And the way the WTO may interpret things at this time, nobody's talking about breaking WTO law, but the probability of actually getting in trouble at WTO over climate change, in our estimation, the risk is not as high as people will take it, because somebody's also going to have to challenge it. And we're not quite sure that that is going to be the case. So the risk of CBD is real by circumstance. It is possible that you will get, but the possibility exists for CBAM to be also to also be challenged. So there's a strategic option, final option that it can be defended as legal, is effective, and risk challenge. Do not risk challenge or risk failure of CBAM as an instrument. So I think there's literally a political choice that you have to make. How risk averse or how risk prone you are, how important do you think it is to Europe? The last thing that I will say, I think that Luis has spoken, and I think somewhere, Luis, we're not very far apart, which is quite interesting, because the way we would see it is European producer of covered goods would have to declare embodied emission and volumes of covered goods exported to certain countries during the preceding year. These producers are issued non-tradable export adjustment certificates based on average emission intensity, and they'll be prorated to reflect any free allocation obtained by producers. For the next compliance period, producer holding export adjustment certificate can exchange this for EUAs and use them toward compliance obligation to surrender EUAs for emission cover. Now, this, why is it interesting, is because it does retain an incentive to decarbonize with an increasing, is the last slide. And the last thing is that we are not expanding the cap because the EU allowances would have to come from under the cap. I'll stop here, Christian. I think it was a lot, and I tried to make it somewhat intelligible. But
it was. Thank you, Andrei, and thank you for this very clear proposal on the table. Jean, the floor is yours. Jean, let me introduce you. I mean, you are a professor of economics at Sciences Po Paris. You are a member of, let me check that, the Peterson's Institute of Economic help me. In Bruegel, of course.
Yeah. Okay, much has been said, and I'm not a specialist of those issues. Let me say that I share both the the view that the mechanism of this sort is absolutely needed because of the difficulty of introducing, and I think the slide by Agnès was very clear in this regard, a much more ambitious legislation than in other parts of the world. So there needs to be a sort of offsetting mechanism. And at the same time, we see all the challenges that have been involved. So I think the first point I would like to make is that we're in perhaps the worst possible environment for this type of discussion in view of the state of the WTO, the attitude of the US administration, the degree of conflict there is globally between China and the US. The idea that we can introduce it and find a solution without having a sort of an umbrella blessing at political level by the G20 or within the framework of the COP, it is really striking to me because it's a fact that countries, even if you're relatively positive about the COP process, the reality is that we're moving at different speed, and that the reality is that the EU is accelerating to an extraordinary extent, and the US is not. There needs to be a sort of political agreement on how to deal with this reality. This reality, in fact, it is in everybody's interest that the EU is moving. But there needs to be at least some guidance on how it can be made compatible with the rules of globalization at the effects. So that's the first thing. The globally. Now, at the EU level, and this has been said in different ways, but let me repeat it. I don't think there is sufficient clarity as regards our goals. We're speaking at the same time of competitiveness. We're speaking of leakages. We're speaking of doing the good globally, so contributing to reducing global emission and raising revenue. Those are not equivalent goals. They're equivalent under extremely simplifying assumptions. When you start, representing the real world, they are not really equivalent. And the sentence that you put on screen with the council conclusion, there was everything in it, every goal, without clarifying what's the priority. So once you start discussing implementation, you're confronted with this issue of what is the real priority. And I think that's a dangerous situation. Then there's the question of implementation, and here I think we already have a long list of difficulties at the stage of implementation. The risk to me is that we have to assume that everything that can go wrong in this process will go wrong at some point. And no, if you're saying, for example, we exclude the indirect emission. The incentive basically to go down, the inter-industry matrix, and so to move, which would be a sort of green offshoring. So basically, you would have an incentive to move downstream to sectors that are not directly covered, and to have your brown inputs covered. So we would essentially lose on, Europe would lose in terms of the competitiveness. It would sort of have, an offshoring of further segments of the value chain without any benefit in terms of emission. And I think that the very fact that this is possible is extremely worrying, because we see that it's going to happen. It's going to be politically something very, very difficult to justify in the system as it is. And there are many of those, potential leakages in terms of the implementation. Think also in terms of the value chains. We are representing it in a world of a very simple world, in which every company produces essentially one good with some inputs, and we're in a world of value chains. And how can it be? How can we think about the way it will work in this world of value chain? And then there is the question of the timetable. The disconnect between the timetable we have in terms of the emission, minus 55% by 2030, and the timetable for the CBAM, which is to start slow, have actually no actual implementation for several years, and then have a gradual implementation on some sectors at some level. I mean, the disconnect is striking between those two timetables. So I think again, I mean, I think it is something of this sort is needed. By contrast, climate clubs are way more simple, because the climate club, I mean, the Modals view is a penalty. It's not something that's linked to the carbon content of what you're doing. It's a penalty that taxes trade, because trade is a global community commodity that you can tax. It's certainly not WTO compatible, but it's in terms of the achievement for climate, it is much more straightforward. And we're again in a world in which the question of what's compatible with the WTO is not necessarily the first question asked in governments, in some governments. I mean, we've had justifications for trade tariffs that were certainly not in spirit, at least in line with WTO requirements. But I think we have to sort of think of this potential alternative and the way it risks in the end to be the one that is going to be contemplated. Let me end on one thing which I consider should be clear on the European side. The idea that it is about revenue. I mean, this NGU, the Council conclusions that it's part of their own resources and that it's going to bring something significant in terms of own resources. I think it's basically a non-starter. It's the role of the CBAM is potentially to make the ETS able to raise much more revenue, because you would end free allowances. But this is not those resources. They would be raised on domestic producers. It's the idea that you're going to tax foreign producers and make foreign producers pay for the EU budget. That's a fantasy, and I think it should be stated clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Maybe, Luis, you want to react to this very pessimistic view on what's going on and what's their political.
I didn't want so much to react, but to ask a question to Jean. When he says, well, we could do the climate club, it would be simpler. I mean, my view is that really the 2 or 3 problems that we have identified as most complicated. First of all, the US. I mean, the problem for the US is they don't have a carbon price, and for internal political reasons, they're not likely to have it. So the climate club, I would pose it to Jean, doesn't solve that key problem. And if you talk about the other problem, well, Jean says, well, you have to kind of put some price around that's trade problematic for trade. Yeah, that is the CBAM, the price around the border, around the club is the CBAM. We could extend it to other countries. So I'm wondering, Jean, my question is, why does it make such a big difference? I mean, what we're talking about is not so far from that, is it?
Jean, you want to react?
Yeah, I mean, react. I mean, the US doesn't have a price. That's right. I mean, we have these discussions that starting at the OECD on the equivalence. So what you could imagine is that if we can agree on an equivalence formula, there would be a sort of threshold below which you would be considered, or a series of thresholds below which you would be considered non-compliant in terms of the effort that are expected from knowing your level of development, and above which you would be considered basically exempt from, at least penalties. But I think it's quite different from trying to find an objective sector by sector measurements of what you need to equalize. It's to say below a certain threshold, you're penalized because you do not contribute. Above a certain threshold, you're more in the rules of trade, not excluding certain adjustment, but not relying on a carbon border adjustment exclusively to make it work.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, look, I'll take a couple of things that you said, Jean. One of them is the G20 or some broader club. You have a club actually. You have the Paris Agreement. It's a club.
Yeah.
On a call that a club. But indeed, I think that at the minimum, you got to have 2 out of the 3 big ones to be able to do something like this. And you have the China or the US with you, or otherwise. I personally think politically it's a difficult thing. But what I would argue is that if you want to do something like this and you don't want to, there's also the risk of CBAM, risk of export, there's the risk of a trade war. There's all kinds of risk in life. But if you want to do something like this, I think G20 is probably at a minimum a club that needs to be brought online, because it's not only the rich countries, but it's a lot of the developing world that is coming up, and they're important. They're not, we're not, as Justin Trudeau would say, it's 2015, it ain't 1950. The second thing is the W compatibility. And again, nobody puts that down, and there are people who live and die by that. There are, junkies for WTO. It's a very complex process. But I would argue that how that is going to be judged in the end, it is a political risk, and it depends how much you want to raise CBAM or not. But that's a possibility. How you can be challenged on that. You want to raise CBAM plus export. It depends what you want to risk. And the final thing, I'm sorry to say, but I fully also agree with you. If I were anybody else, why would I let them pay money to the EU instead of paying money to my own treasury? That makes absolutely no sense. So the fact that the EU is going to collect money from CBAM sounds to me as a very counterintuitive project. Why would, if I'm the People's Republic of China, I'm going to tax the guys at home, and this flies and keep the money rather than send it to Brussels. That makes absolutely no sense. So the money, the fight over the money, I don't think it's a big item. I think it's more the fact of how much do you want to, how much does free allocation protect you, and how much does the CBAM protect you? Because it is about the environment, but it's about 9% of global emissions. We are 9% of global emissions, and I'm not saying this is not important, but also in order to be able to change, you've got to be able to have an industry in Europe. If we don't have that, we can't do it.
We should never forget that CBAM revenues are likely to be very small, especially given the timetable you were mentioning. So the idea is to incentivize other countries also to introduce their own prices. So I think this discussion is much too, we should not discuss this at this stage, because it's much too early to talk about that. This is a Pigovian price. So the idea is to have a zero revenue. This is the objective. And in your case of club, in another club, probably you would have much more revenue.
Yeah.
So
yes, but we agree on the fact that CBAM is clearly more complex than the climate club. At the same time, it's more likely to pass through WTO restriction with compliance. So So yeah, but keep in mind that anyway, I mean, fighting climate change is an extremely complex issue at the world level, and we need to confront those complexities and try to solve them. I mean, Jean, I find you, I mean, it's very dangerous to go for climate club because I believe that it will not go through the WTO compliance. So I mean, I'm stressed by what you say because it's really risky to read everything. And again, let me start, as you said, I mean, you repeat myself, and if we are not able to confront the carbon leakage issue, it will be extremely difficult for Europe to try to attain the ambitious objective it decided to try to attain.
May I ask a question to Luis? I mean, we speaking of the fact, we agree that the revenue is going to be minor. And we agree that politically to have this revenue raised on exporters would be regarded as, and difficult to justify tax on foreign producers, especially from developing countries. Why don't you vote it be attributed to supporting the climate transition in developing countries? I mean, we have this, this 100 billion issue with the Paris Agreement. Why not say it's a Pigovian tax? It's going to be entirely allocated to supporting the transition in less developed countries.
Just before Luis intervenes, just mention that it's part of the question of the Q&A. I have at least 3 questions related to what do we do with income and what, okay, sure, and whether there should be something specific for poor countries.
So let me first say that there are many people in Parliament who think that that should be the case. The arguments against are a formal one. There was an interinstitutional agreement when we developed the Next Generation EU that says there are a set of own resources. So the fear that we have is the following: a set of own resources that should go towards paying the debt that has been raised by Europe. The fear that many of us have is that we have a vision of like this Hamiltonian moment. You have contributed to thinking and to putting it in place, that we have debt, we have something to pay the debt with. And that every time something comes that we can use to pay the debt with, there is a lot of claimants to this money. The countries, the LDCs, the da. So it seems like every time there's a very good excuse for not putting the money towards the use that was the. We need around 15 billion a year at least to, at the very least, pay the interest, etc. from the. So 1-2 billion can do little by little, it can do something. So I would say there is a formal kind of commitment issue, which is that we said we were going to use it for this, but there's also a real kind of underlying need to show that Europe is really able to put its money where its mouth was, that we're going to proceed with repaying the debt through the EU new own resources instead of through member states' budgets. So there is a lot of other claimants. There is the one that Jean puts on the table, the LDCs in the countries that would have to do this transition. There is another claimant who is European environmental expenditure. There are all sorts of other claimants kind of trying to get this money. And what I would say is, my view personally is we need to put as much of these new own resources that will not be, none of them will be as big as anticipated, and all of them will be eventually have lots of claimants towards repaying the next gen EU as we promised we would.
Thank you, Luis. Andrei?
Yeah, look, I don't know how steeped you are into this language, because this language is full of acronyms and we like to keep it that way. But well, I mean, it's a club. So the question that I would, there was something called the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, that in the end got renamed the China Development Mechanism. And the opposition came, right or wrong, and in fact, I like the mechanism, but the opposition came because a lot of the money was fed into, from the clean development into Chinese economy, into Chinese renewable energy project, into Chinese chemical industry. So at some point, you have firms like German chemical industry saying, why am I paying to modernize the Chinese industry to compete with me? This is crazy. So that's one thing that I think we need to remind ourselves of that. The second thing is, I repeat what I said before, LDC and CIDs, when we go to UNFCCC negotiation, it's always, I don't know, whatever, LDC and CIDs are different. That's the way it is. And that's part of the culture. But the reality is that nobody from LDCs or CIDs exports anything that is carbon intensive, that is in these 5 sectors or other sectors, except Mozambique, who exports aluminum. So this is the Mozambique bill. If you do that, that's what it is. Nothing wrong with that. But let's be realistic about it. It's not going to help. I mean, it's not addressed to this. So the final thing that I wanted to say is this payment actually is not paid by the exporter, it's paid by the importers. Actually, it's not paid by the exporter, it's paid by the importer. It's semantics, but semantics matter. So if what you're going to do with the money, in my own opinion, if you want to do something with the money, we have spent enormous amount of money, and the German ratepayer knows that, for decarbonizing power. Because decarbonizing power hasn't been done on the ETS, has been done on enormous amount of money being spent on that. Now we are, the turn of the industrialists, and they're looking around and saying, well, I mean, this is going to be even more complicated because these guys were not exposed to competition, except Morocco and Ukraine, and I don't know what, very marginal. But we are in a very serious kind of situation. So what they're proposing said, listen, I also need the same amount of money. There are instruments that I've been putting forward, like contract for difference, that would make some sense in order to be efficient and help the decarbonized industry. So I would argue that if that is the case, and we want to speed up decarbonization in Europe because we want to, we don't want to have these instruments, we will all decarbonize more fine, then I think probably the rational thing is to speed up industrial decarbonization in Europe. That would be my argument.
So Jacques Delplat is proposing to redistribute the CBAM revenue to each country exporting their product to us, 100%. But the problem is most of the CBAM carbon border adjustment will be paid by European consumers, not by the exporting country to us. So I'm not sure it's a good idea. In fact, we should keep in mind this pass-through mechanism of price, so that we really have a social acceptability issue for European consumers to accept the CBAM. We need to keep in mind that currently, indeed, most people believe that, as you said, Jean, that the price will be paid by the exporters. In fact, it will be paid mostly by European consumers. We know that as economists. So we need to keep that in mind when we think about what to do with the revenue. It's clearly saying we need to.
If so, it's not going to be, a receipt for the budget, right? It's not going to be. You can't use it both ways. If you're saying it has to be given back to the consumer, it's being given back to the consumer, not to the.
Exactly. So
part of this budget, this debt is used to subsidize energy transition, to subsidize investment into decarbonized power, and we have to pay back this debt to. So, for instance, this in Dunkirk, the steel ArcelorMittal, they have been subsidized for transforming, and this part of the France to a 2030 plan, which is financed by the European budget based on debt. So that's.
Luis, I have a question for you. Why not add that comes from the Q&A? Why not adding products from agriculture?
I think that my ultimate aim, except for the whole getting in a fight with the US problem, would be to expand CBAM to every area where the ETS is covering. As we expand ETS, we should also expand CBAM. At the moment, the coverage of ETS is the one that I mentioned. So that would be it's the 11,000 industrial installation. I would love to hear Agnès on Jean's suggestion on the money. I don't know what she thinks. Yes, it's not so much money, but it's the money we have.
Okay. Yeah, I would like to go back to the priority, priority issue raised by Jean.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I was just asking if Agnès could comment on this money thing. I don't know if she can.
So on money, I sympathize with Luis on the fact that we are committed to repay this NGEU project. So if at some point there is no longer the idea of repaying the NGEU, then we have the money, but otherwise we need to stick to the commitment. And on top of that, we should be aware that, well, for instance, the EU already contributes very much to the funding of investment for mitigation in developing countries. So it's a bit of a quid pro quo. You can do some window dressing and use the money to fund these investments, but it's already the case that this money is flowing. So I think it's better to think about how much we want to direct, how much money we want to direct to these countries, irrespective of whether they are going to pay CBAM or not, because as you said, CBAM is not going to be paid very much by European countries. It's especially.
No, I believe you were.
I think the real money is the ETS money.
Yeah.
Sure. By a very large factor. I mean, it's not the same order of magnitude. And ETS money, we're creating rents, right? Because they are governments that receive the money from the sale of permits at an inflated price, and this is good. I mean, the price has to go up, but this is creating rents.
Well, this is going to be used to compensate the households. This money is going to compensate.
Well, yes, but that, you know, if you assume that there is a producer in country A within the EU, the producer has to pay to buy ETS permits. Its government is selling permits. The consumer may be in another EU country. In an open economy, there is no reason why they are in the same country, right? So basically, in terms of the allocation of receipt, that doesn't correspond to what it should be.
Yeah, well, most of the receipts are going to be used to settle the debt. And part of it will be used to compensate the households.
For the second ETS, the new ETS. We are talking about the new ETS.
I'm talking about the existing ETS. All the money goes to the member states. Yeah. And the member states, and the member states, it's correspondent on their industrial structure, not on the consumption structure.
Yeah, but you need to incentive to,
I mean,
but in California, it's not the CBAM money because they don't get it's in general money when you do get it from auction. A lot of the money goes to the consumer. It does go to the consumer. You end up in a situation right now where you go to Warsaw and you have billboards saying that 60% of your bill is due to carbon prices. That I didn't make it up; it's there. Go to Warsaw. So I think at some point we have a problem with things that whether they're real or not, or their perception or not. And I think the European consumer will pay for these things, and they will perceive that something needs to be done to alleviate this transition. So my sense is that somebody is going to have this. It's not a lot of money. I agree with you, not a lot of money, but the aesthetics of it will matter as to what you do with that money. And probably from a political point of view, probably going to the consumers is at least symbolically part of it going to consumers. Probably something that you need to do. Or there's money have to come from somewhere.
Could I come back? I have one question on climate clubs again. The question is, how can we make the climate club idea fly? With which country, in fact, which region of the world? So Europe, of course, but what would come? Who would come with Europe to form this coalition? US in the short run, it's not very likely. China would be very surprised. So I don't see, Jean, how we can solve the carbon leakage problem to decide this Nordos idea at this stage. I mean, I don't see any support, strong support internationally on this.
Obviously the real test would be the US and then China. Yeah, that's what matters. I mean, a climate club that would be limited to the EU and a few like-minded countries wouldn't make sense. That wouldn't solve any of the problems we're speaking of.
That's why you have to have two other three big economic blocks. You have to have 2 or 3. Then maybe then you have a critical mass and you can move. The EU alone, again, unfortunately, I don't see another solution. I have my own level of skepticism. The problem is that I don't see another solution and outside the CBAM, because carbon free allocation, as much as industry loves it, and I understand why they love it, but it's simply going to mathematically run out. And we're 2022, 23, by 5 years from now, they're just not going to be enough. We're going to start having these cross-sectoral correction factors. It's going to cut everybody. That doesn't work.
I think the problem with the climate club is we need the coordination into the implementation of a climate policy. We have not observed that. We have coordinated on target, but not on carbon pricing, carbon standard, technical standard, and so on. So historically, it doesn't work. So that's why the CBAM is another decentralized initiative of climate policy combined to trade.
Okay, so things are difficult. I would like not to conclude just with this idea. I see convergence here on the roundtable and with Stefan too about having to think harder than what Brussels has been able to do now on exports and rebates for exports. So I'm claiming that, and I think we agree on this, European Union cannot do the good for the entire world. That is, we can induce importers to apply the same carbon price as us at the carbon border adjustment, but we cannot force Brazilian consumers to purchase steels, European steel with the carbon price included in that, because we cannot control competition on Brazilian market, and we need to recognize that. So I understand that we have here a consensus about recognizing that, and that we need to offer rebates for export. The problem associated to that is that Europe loses fractions of the control of its overall emission on which it has a commitment. So that's a problem we need to think about. So we are close to finishing this roundtable. Do you want to have a final word, each of you? Let me start with Luis.
Yeah, I wanted to, it's going to be very provocative, but since we have a good crowd of economists and people to start thinking about it. So imagine that the lesson of Ukraine, we still don't know what the lesson is going to be, is don't trade with the enemy, right? And don't trade with the enemy.
With the enemy.
Yes. So that means that we have to start considering what this Chinese scholar was writing in his essay a couple of weeks ago. You probably already. He was fearing that we will have a club with the US and Indonesia and Japan and Korea and us and Europe, etc. A free trade democracy club. And I was wondering, like, okay, if we move towards a different world system where WTO is obsolete and where our ideas about free trade that we all defended, me the first person, gets superseded by geopolitics and the rest, would that world, which is not optimal, okay, I'm not defending it, it's just a question of whether China falls on this war eventually, whether it falls on the Russian side or on the other side. If that happens, then we have a chance to turn that bad news into good in some sense by saying, okay, this new club is the club of the democracies, of the free trading nations. It's going to have as one of its components a CO2 price or a CO2 club. So is this geopolitics disaster that is falling on us something that could potentially be an opportunity in this respect. And that was what I wanted to raise.
We are not politicians, Luis, so it's hard to answer the question, but indeed, there is a collision these days about climate policies and defense of democracies. And we need to think hard about that, and we need to think harder about how to go to energy sobriety today in Europe in order to reduce the funding of the war machine of Russia in Ukraine. But is it not immediately related to CBAM? But there is a relation. Indeed, this is trade. I mean, up to now, we believe that trade was a source of peace. These days, we should use trade as a way to implement things that are good for humanity, and it's not easy. Anyone else want to intervene to conclude?
Just to follow up, I think Luis is right to ask us to think in these terms, not because we are already in the world he's describing, but we are probably as distant from the world we had implicitly in mind, the world where we have a global order, we have rules, we abide by the rules, we have a trade institution, and we need to sort of comply and think in terms of how climate fits into this rules-based order. We're as distant from this world as from the world that Luis is describing. And that's the difficulty we're facing.
And there is also a proximity in terms of having a coalition that would be able to manipulate terms of trade, which is a question that is very much in the current debate with respect to the sanctions, and could be also a way to force non-club countries to change their economic model, because exporting brown goods, oil and later other goods would no longer be fruitful. No, they would. So the terms of trade would reverse, and so maybe we should also think about that.
I am not a politician. I would say that I would rather bet my money on CBAM or something else rather than open that door, because once you open that door, you step through it, and you may end up with a very nice world, but you may end up with who knows what. So I would rather not think in those terms. You know, I live behind the Iron Curtain. I don't want to live behind the climate curtain.
Okay, Stefan, you want to say as well?
Well, maybe to be more optimistic, suppose that we reach the carbon neutrality target in 2050. So then this means that we have a dry or tax base for carbon pricing. But we will need CBAM to keep the carbon neutrality. So I think that for this reason, CBAM is important for Europe.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Ho. That was a very deep discussion on an important issue, which clearly remains very complex, but we must get a victory here if we want to really be able to fight climate change at the right intensity and level. Thank you very much.